If people are tortured forever after they die, it seems to me that the reverse is true. God's love for them endured for a moment, for their lifetime, but once they're dead, now he turns on his vicious wrath, and it never ends. His love endures for a moment, but his anger endures forever. How do you reconcile those things? It becomes particularly challenging when you consider several other verses. For example, Lamentations 3, which says, though Yahweh brings grief, he does that, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing and unending, which we sang about earlier, his unending love. For he does not, listen to this, he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to any human being. Affliction and grief are never God's ideal will. He uses them, yes, to punish people, to teach people, to chastise people, to discipline people, but that's never his last word. Compassion and love are his final word. But how is that consistent with the teaching that God will eternally afflict people in the torments of hell? Now, maybe you'll say, well, wait a minute, God's not the one afflicting them. They're afflicting themselves. They put themselves there. They deserve that. And I would agree with you. They put themselves there. I don't believe, some Christians teach this, but I don't believe that God predestined them to go to hell. I don't think he wants anyone to go to hell. But they're there, and they put themselves there. So yes, that's true. But at the same time, being honest here, maybe I think too much. I've been accused of that, but I think it's a good question. God is the one who holds everything in existence. Hebrews 1:3, he holds all things together by the word of his power. Nothing exists unless God's willing it to exist, holding it in existence. So here God is holding these people in existence in this tortured state. And why? In the traditional teaching, he's not trying to redeem them anymore. He's not trying to teach them a lesson. He's not trying to make a point. The only purpose for their existing is to experience nightmarish pain. God's holding them in existence so they'll continue to experience hopeless, nightmarish pain. How is that consistent with the teaching that he doesn't willingly afflict any human being? Another set of questions is this. How is eternal punishment consistent with the teaching that God is love? Love isn't simply something that God does. Love is the essence of who God is. Everything God does expresses who he is, so everything God does is motivated by love. Just like the Bible tells us, commands us to be motivated by love in all that we do. Why? Because we're supposed to be godly, and that's what God is like. So everything God does is motivated by love. Which leads to this question. How is it loving to keep people burning alive forever and ever and ever and ever? I'm just wondering that out loud. Third set of questions is this. How is the teaching on eternal torment consistent with the Bible's teaching regarding God's final victory? The Bible teaches over and over again, gives us this marvelous picture of the end. And it just is glorious. It's all glorious without qualification. The Bible says, for example, that all things will be brought together under one head, who is Christ, Ephesians 1. There's this glorious picture there of Christ reigning. Everything is now part of his body. It's all under him, and he's the head over all things. The Bible says that someday God will be all in all. His love will define every square inch of the cosmos. The Bible tells us that someday all creatures in heaven and earth will bow in worship before the throne. The Bible tells us that all things will be restored someday, and everything will be reconciled to God, Colossians 1 and Acts 3 and other passages. The Bible gives us a picture of the final state as being one in which there'll be no more sorrow and no more tears to wipe away every tear from our eyes. There'll be no more violence and no more death, Revelations 21 and a bunch of other passages. So what I'm wondering, just to be honest with you, is this. How can God be all in all if throughout eternity Satan will be torturing people, rebellious people in hell? How can we say that all things will be restored and reconciled to God if throughout eternity there's going to be this valley of despair where people aren't reconciled to God? How can we say there'll be no more tears and no more sorrow if for a good portion of humanity there'll be nothing but, for all eternity, tears and sorrow? And how can we look forward to a day when there'll be no more violence if throughout eternity people are going to be being burned alive? Because it seems to me burning someone alive is sort of a violent act. And even if you take that as a metaphor, it's still a very violent metaphor denoting something violent. These are just some of the questions that I have regarding this traditional teaching about eternal conscious suffering. And it makes me wonder if there's another way of looking at things. Now, if we come to the conclusion that this is just what the Bible teaches, that's all there is to say about it, well, then we just got to deal with that. Some things are just beyond our capacity to figure out, and we just got to say it's a mystery. But whenever we find things in the Bible that really don't seem to match up, as I just gave you here, there's tensions. I think it's reasonable and even godly to ask the question, might we be missing something? Perhaps we misunderstood something. Let's look at it again. Is there a way of bringing these things together as much as possible? There'll always be an element of mystery, of course. But if it's possible to bring some coherence to this and make things consistent, I think it's important that we try to do that. People differ a little bit on this, but for everybody to some degree, and for some of us to a large degree, our heart has trouble being passionate about something that our head can't make any sense out of. The more congruity there is in your head in your view of God and the world and whatever, the more your heart can get involved in it and say yes to it. If something just seems utterly, utterly irrational and nonsensical, you may still believe it, but it's harder, and for some of us, almost impossible to get passionately behind it. So it makes sense to say, is there another way of looking at this? And I'm going to offer here another way of looking at it. You don't have to agree. If you come to the conclusion that the Bible teaches that, in fact, there'll be this eternal torture, then I respect you for that, and that's fine. What's important is that we're all authentic and honest in wrestling with the text. There's 4 considerations that lead me to consider an alternative perspective. It's a perspective that has been taught in various times and places throughout church history. It was particularly present in the early church, but it's never been the dominant view. Some argue that it was the dominant view in the early church, but that's questionable. But in any case, it's not altogether new. To get at that position, I'm going to very briefly outline 4 biblical considerations. Okay, so just follow me and think about this. Number 1, remember that the parable of the rich man and Lazarus is a parable. And as I said several weeks ago in talking about the parable of the dishonest manager, it's really important when you're interpreting parables that you pay attention to the main point or points and realize that everything else is a prop, a setup to make that point. It's like telling a joke. With a joke, the punchline is everything, and everything else about the joke is just there to lead you to that punchline. That's how parables are. The main point is the only point you're supposed to get. And so, with the parable of the dishonest manager, it would really be wrong to try to deduce from that parable principles of management. Oh, I guess Jesus is saying it's okay for us to be dishonest. No, he's not saying that. That wasn't the point of the parable. The point of the parable is not that we should be dishonest like the manager, but that we should have the forethought of the manager. We should be looking ahead. So also here, the main point I'll get to next week, but it's not. The point of this parable is not to teach us the nature of heaven and the nature of hell or anything of the sort. And so we've got to be very careful about drawing any conclusions about heaven or hell based on this parable. Number 2, we need to realize that there are a diversity of metaphors used to describe God's final punishment in the Bible. For example, Gehenna is one. Gehenna is the word that's translated hell in the New Testament. But it literally referred to a valley that was a dump outside of Jerusalem, the valley of Gihon. And so when Jesus talks about hell, he's referring to this dump that everyone knows about. To reject God is to be thrown out into the dump. Now everyone would know that he's talking metaphorically. It's a metaphor. He's simply saying if you're not compatible with God, then you're not fit for the purpose for which you were created, and so you'll be thrown away like everything else gets thrown away that's no longer fit for the reason that it exists, and it goes out into the dump outside of Jerusalem. But it's a metaphor. You've got to be careful about pressing it too much for literal details. Another metaphor is being consumed with unquenchable fire. In Matthew 3, John the Baptist says that the Messiah will clear his threshing floor, gathering his wheat into the barn, but burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire. So there's the gathering in the barn, the wheat, and then there's the burning up of the chaff. But note that the chaff gets burned up. The unquenchable fire, by the way, does not signify that the chaff will be getting burned forever and ever and ever.